Kansas, 1878. A land of endless plains, where the wind moved like a restless spirit through tall grass and wooden barns. Most families here lived quiet, predictable lives. Farmers who knew every seed they planted, every storm they feared, every neighbor they trusted. But then came the family no one could explain. A family whose story still lingers in whispers, more than a century later. The house they lived in is long gone, but even today, locals claim the ground itself feels wrong, as if something unnatural was born there. Tonight, you'll hear about the four brothers who defied science and haunted medicine forever. But before we begin, I have a question for you. Where in the world are you watching from? Write it in the comments. I want to know how far this mystery will travel tonight. And if you love exploring the darkest corners of history, subscribe to Cold Mysteries, because each week we open another case the world tried to bury. Another secret the world prayed you'd forget. Now let's step back into Kansas, 1878, and meet the boys no one could ever explain. The family lived on the outskirts of a small farming town, a quiet, isolated farmhouse surrounded by fields of wheat that rolled like waves under the prairie wind. On the surface, the parents seemed ordinary, devout, hardworking, respected in church. But the births of their four sons soon convinced neighbors that this family was anything but ordinary. Each boy was born healthy. Strong cries, steady lungs, no signs of weakness. Yet, as they grew, the community began to notice. These children were not like others. The eldest, barely 6 years old, could lift sacks of grain that grown men struggled to carry. Farmers who saw it swore no child his age should have such power. The second, pale and wiry, was said never to sleep. Neighbors who watched the farmhouse late into the night claimed they saw his candlelit figure moving behind windows. Even at dawn, the third boy startled everyone with his speech. At 2 years old, while other children mumbled broken words, he spoke in clear, unsettling sentences. "The rain comes tomorrow," he once told a farmer's wife, and sure enough, the storm arrived, and the youngest, the quietest. Animals recoiled from him. Dogs growled. Horses refused to move forward when he stood near the road. His silence, combined with the way creatures reacted to him, made even his own schoolteacher cross herself when he entered the room. By the late 1870s, Kansas was a land hungry for reason, but still rooted in superstition. Neighbors whispered that the family was cursed, that four sons with such unnatural qualities could only be touched by the devil's hand. Others argued it was science, something rare in their blood, something medical yet undiscovered. But whether through faith or science, fear was growing. And fear has a way of twisting communities into cruelty. The town preacher declared the brothers marked and warned parishioners to keep their distance. But not all agreed. Some believed the boys represented progress, the next step in human strength, endurance, and intelligence. This division split the town in two, those who feared them and those who wanted to study them. But as the years passed, one thing became clear. The brothers were becoming more powerful, and the older they grew, the harder it became to ignore the unnatural shadow their presence cast across Kansas. Four brothers, four enigmas. One family that stood at the border between curse and evolution. But the strangest part, this was only the beginning. The accidents, the stares, the tragedies had not yet arrived, and when they did, Kansas would never forget the year 1878, the year four brothers walked into history and out of explanation. By the time the brothers reached their early childhood, the town no longer whispered about them, it watched them. Every movement, every word, every unnatural silence was observed with nervous fascination. And slowly, each brother began to reveal his own gift, or curse. The eldest, Samuel, was only 8 years old when he shocked a group of farmhands struggling to lift a wagon wheel from the mud. With little effort, the boy dug his heels into the dirt, pushed with all his might, and the wheel shifted free. The men laughed nervously at first, until they realized Samuel had moved it alone. His small body carried the force of 3 men. The blacksmith swore he'd seen the child split wood faster than his apprentices, and once, when another boy mocked him at school, Samuel pushed the child across the yard with such force that the boy's collarbone snapped. The whispers changed. Samuel was no longer just unusual. He was dangerous. Then there was Elias, the second brother. Thin, pale, with wide-set eyes that never seemed to close. His mother swore he hadn't slept more than a few hours since infancy. Neighbors confirmed it. Passing by the farmhouse at all hours of the night, They saw his shadow in the upstairs window, sitting, standing, pacing, but never lying down. One farmer's wife recalled seeing him at 3 in the morning, staring at the moon for so long that she felt compelled to cross herself. Teachers complained that Elias was unnerving. He never yawned, never blinked too much, always alert. And when asked if he felt tired, he would only shake his head and whisper, "The night isn't for sleep. The night is for listening." No one knew what he meant. The third brother, Nathaniel, spoke too soon, too clearly, and too confidently. By the age of 5, he was reciting lines from the Bible, passages his parents swore he'd never been taught. He corrected adults in church, pointing out inconsistencies in sermons. When storms came, he predicted them days before. When cattle fell sick, Nathaniel would calmly announce which ones would survive and which would not. His predictions were always correct. The town school teacher described him as a boy with the voice of an old man. His eyes held a weight, a knowing that unsettled even the elders. Some claimed he was gifted, others said he was possessed. The youngest, Thomas, was the quietest of all. He spoke rarely, often only when spoken to, but animals sensed something within him. Dogs barked uncontrollably in his presence. Horses refused to walk past him. Chickens scattered when he entered the yard. And when Thomas did speak, it chilled those who heard him. Once, while watching a funeral procession, he tugged on his mother's dress and whispered, "There will be another coffin before the week ends." 3 days later, an elderly farmer dropped dead of a stroke. Coincidence? Or something darker? To the townsfolk, it didn't matter. Fear was already setting in. As these traits became undeniable, the family's once quiet farmhouse turned into a site of fascination. Strangers lingered by the fence, whispering. Children dared each other to touch the gate, as though it were cursed. Some claimed the very air felt heavier near their land. The parents insisted their boys were blessings, not monsters. God's miracles take many forms, their father said, but not everyone agreed. Some neighbors muttered that miracles did not terrify livestock, nor did they predict funerals, and the more the brothers grew, the stronger their unnatural qualities became. One boy could break you with his bare hands. Another would watch you through the night, never sleeping. The third could see things he shouldn't know, and the fourth could silence a room with a single word. Individually, they were unsettling. Together, they became a mystery the town could not ignore. And soon, that mystery would turn into fear. Fear that would divide the town and draw the first outsiders into their story. By the spring of 1879, the 4 brothers were no longer just a curiosity. They were a problem, a living question that gnawed at the edges of faith and reason. And the town of Leavenworth County, a place built on prayer, sweat, and superstition, was beginning to split apart. It started with the children. Other boys and girls began avoiding the Caldwell brothers at school. They claimed Samuel's touch left bruises too easily. They swore Elias's unblinking stare followed them even when they turned away. One girl, just 10 years old, told her mother that Nathaniel had finished her sentence for her before she even spoke. The girl wept, insisting that he heard her words inside her head. And Thomas, the youngest, had almost no friends. When he entered the classroom, the laughter stopped. The room grew heavy. Even the teacher confessed to the minister that she felt her knees weaken when Thomas locked eyes with her. Soon, children began refusing to sit near them. Parents quietly encouraged it. In a town where Sunday service was sacred, the brothers' presence at church created deep unease. When Samuel sang hymns, his booming voice drowned out the rest. When Elias sat through sermons, he stared at the pastor with that sleepless gaze, blinking almost not at all. Nathaniel sometimes whispered lines of scripture before the preacher reached them in his sermon. And once, when Thomas bowed his head in silence, the candles on the altar flickered violently, though no wind was present. Some worshippers claimed it was proof of unholy influence. Others argued that the brothers were gifted by God, living testaments to miracles science could not grasp. The minister himself was torn. His sermons shifted between warnings about unnatural gifts and reassurances that all children are born of God. But each week, more pews sat empty when the brothers attended. Then came the accidents. A farmhand was crushed beneath a wagon after Samuel was seen helping to lift it. A boy broke his arm falling from a tree Nathaniel had warned him not to climb. And worst of all, livestock deaths. Cows were found dead in fields after Elias had been spotted wandering nearby at night. Chickens were discovered lifeless in coops after Thomas had stood silently at the fence. Were these coincidences or curses? The town couldn't decide. But the pattern, real or imagined, was impossible to ignore. Neighbors stopped visiting the farmhouse. Tradesmen delivered supplies at the edge of the property, refusing to step inside. Children crossed to the opposite side of the road when the brothers walked by. Rumors spread like wildfire. That the boys were not born, but summoned. That their mother had once been seen burying jars in the earth at midnight. That their father had struck a bargain with something no church could bless. The family insisted none of it was true. But in Kansas in 1879, truth mattered less than fear. And fear had already taken root. Everything changed one evening when a prayer circle gathered in the church basement. A young woman, trembling, confessed that Elias had stood outside her window the night before. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't spoken. He had only stood there, staring into her room, for hours. When she finally screamed for her father, Elias turned and walked into the fields without a word. The preacher tried to calm the group. He reminded them that children are only children. But when he spoke, an elder in the town stood and shouted, "Children, do not stare into windows at midnight. Children do not frighten animals. Children do not defy sleep and speak words beyond their age. These boys are not ours. They are the devil's." That night, the town was divided for good. Some demanded the brothers be driven out. Others insisted they must be studied. Either way, the Caldwell brothers could no longer live in silence. They were becoming the center of a storm that would only grow darker, and Kansas was about to learn what happens when a community's fear collides with the unexplainable. By 1880, whispers about the Caldwell brothers had stretched far beyond Kansas. Newspapers rarely printed stories of superstition, but this was different. 4 boys in a single family, each exhibiting traits science could not explain. That was enough to lure doctors, professors, even traveling skeptics to the town's edge. The brothers, once a local fear, were becoming a national curiosity. The first to arrive was Dr. Alistair Green, a physician from St. Louis known for his obsession with anomalies. He convinced the family to allow a series of examinations, promising to prove their sons were not cursed, but extraordinary. But what Green found only deepened the mystery. Samuel's grip strength measured higher than any man the doctor had ever tested. His pulse barely rose even after lifting weights for hours. Elias, examined over several nights, showed no fatigue, no REM cycles, no evidence of natural sleep. His eyes dilated strangely under lamplight, and yet his mind remained sharp. Nathaniel's vocabulary and memory stunned Green. The boy could recall entire passages of books he had skimmed once, word for word. He solved complex arithmetic in his head faster than Green's assistant could write the numbers down, and Thomas unsettled the physician most of all. When Green entered the room, Thomas said without looking up, "You carry laudanum in your left coat pocket for your shaking hands." The doctor froze. He had indeed hidden a small vial, something no one had seen him place there. He demanded to know how Thomas had guessed. The boy only smiled faintly and replied, "I didn't guess." Green's notes, preserved in fragments, reveal his disbelief. He wrote that the brothers' bodies resisted conventional classification. Their heart rates fluctuated in ways that did not align with exertion. Their body temperatures rose and fell unnaturally, sometimes dropping below normal without signs of illness. When pricked with a needle, their wounds bled less than expected. When exposed to cold water, their skin showed no gooseflesh. When placed under strain, they exhibited little fatigue. Green described them as human, but not governed by human limitation. Other physicians soon followed, drawn by rumor. Some claimed it was a genetic mutation. Others argued it was fraud. But each who examined the boys left with more questions than answers, and not all of them left unscathed. One doctor reported suffering migraines for weeks after working with Elias, insisting the boy's eyes seemed to pull at the mind. Another swore that Nathaniel repeated words he had not yet spoken aloud, as though the child anticipated his thoughts. Medical staff began whispering among themselves. They said the air grew colder when Thomas entered a room. They said Samuel once cracked a chair leg simply by gripping it too tightly, his face calm as though unaware of his own strength. Whether these were exaggerations or genuine effects, the conclusion was clear: the Caldwell brothers had crossed the threshold from local folklore into medical mystery. By the autumn of 1880, newspapers carried hints of the story. Articles avoided words like curse or devil, instead calling the brothers prodigies or specimens of interest. Yet between the lines, fear bled through. Headlines asked questions the doctors dared not answer. Are these boys the future of man? The Kansas children who do not tire? Miracle, curse, or evolution? The family, overwhelmed by attention, withdrew further into isolation. The father refused more examinations. The mother shielded her sons from reporters. But the boys' reputation had already grown larger than the farmhouse that held them. And yet, for all their wonder, there was one detail that every doctor, every visitor, recorded in hushed tones. The brothers did not fear. They did not fidget under needles. They did not cry at harsh words. They did not tremble when accused of things they had not done. Instead, they watched, calm, unblinking, patient, as if they were not being studied, but studying everyone else. And to the doctors who came searching for answers, that was more frightening than any test result. The world had placed the brothers under the microscope. But what the world didn't yet realize was that the microscope worked both ways, and soon fear would spread from the family farmhouse to every corner of Kansas. By the time the Caldwell brothers reached their teenage years, their strangeness had transformed from rumor into terror. What once made neighbors whisper now made them cross the road, lock their doors, and pray to God the boys would pass their homes without stopping. Because whatever the brothers were becoming, they were no longer children. Samuel, the eldest, had grown tall, broad-shouldered, his hands thick with calluses. But it wasn't his size that frightened people. It was what he did with it. One summer, during a barn raising, a wooden beam slipped from its rigging. Men shouted, scattering to avoid the crash. Samuel caught it. Alone. Witnesses swore they saw the 16-year-old steady the massive timber long enough for others to escape. His face, they said, remained calm, as though it had required no effort at all. But later that year, a farmhand insulted him during a card game. Samuel stood, lifted the man by the collar with one hand, and held him against the wall until his face turned purple. When others intervened, Samuel let go without a word. The message was clear. Samuel's strength was no longer a wonder. It was a weapon. Elias remained sleepless, his skin pale as candle wax, his eyes heavy yet unclosing. Townsfolk swore they saw him wandering the fields at all hours, never stumbling, never resting. One winter's night, a neighbor's barn caught fire. As the family screamed, Elias was the first to arrive. They said he walked calmly into the smoke and pulled out 2 children before the flames consumed the roof. Yet, when the sheriff asked how he knew they were inside, Elias only whispered, "The night told me." What did that mean? No one knew. But afterward, some swore they could see him standing in the fields at dusk, motionless, staring at homes as the lamps went out inside. Watching. Always watching. Nathaniel's intelligence grew sharper, unsettling. At 14, he corrected a traveling professor during a lecture. Quoting medical journals the man was certain had never been available in Kansas. He spoke of astronomy, of illnesses, of architecture, all with unsettling certainty. And when townsfolk asked where he had learned these things, he would only reply, "I remember." Worse still, he began predicting events with chilling accuracy. A harvest ruined by hail, a horse's sudden death, a boy's broken leg before the fall had even occurred. Every prediction that came true tightened the knot of fear around the town. Parents warned their children never to speak to him, but some said the real terror was not in what Nathaniel predicted, but in how calmly he waited for it to come true. And then there was Thomas, the youngest. Quiet, withdrawn, but no less terrifying. Animals continued to avoid him, but now people did too. When Thomas spoke, his words cut deep. At a church picnic, he sat beside a woman who had just buried her husband. Without turning his head, he murmured, "You'll be joining him soon." Weeks later, she died of sudden fever. Coincidence? Perhaps, but when a boy of 13 delivers a prophecy of death, and it comes true, coincidence no longer satisfies the imagination. Some townsfolk began to call him the Grave Whisperer. Others simply refused to look him in the eye. Together, the brothers were no longer curiosities. They were omens. When they walked through town, conversation stopped. Mothers pulled their children close. Men spat over their shoulders to ward off evil. Farmers whispered that the crops failed more often when the brothers walked the fields. That livestock gave birth to sickly calves when Thomas lingered near. That tempers grew hotter, accidents deadlier, whenever Samuel's shadow darkened a doorframe. And, though no one could prove it, no one dared to doubt it either. By their teenage years, the Caldwell brothers had become more than Kansas could contain. One brother wielded unnatural strength. Another walked endless nights without rest. A third carried knowledge he should not have. And the youngest spoke of death as if he had already seen it waiting. And all 4 seemed to grow stronger with every passing year. The town could no longer ignore them, and soon its fear would boil into action. By 1882, the Caldwell brothers had outgrown whispers. What once lingered as gossip in kitchens and pews had now curdled into open dread. The town no longer asked what the boys were. It asked when something terrible would happen.
And then it did. It began with a death.
A boy named Matthew, barely 12, was found in the creek one summer morning. His skull cracked against the rocks, his body pale and still. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Children often swam there, and the current was strong. But rumors spread faster than the water. Matthew had been seen playing with Samuel only the day before. Witnesses whispered that Samuel had dared him to leap from the rocks, that his unnatural strength might have pushed Matthew too far. No proof was ever found. But in the hearts of grieving parents, proof mattered less than suspicion. Not long after, a farmer's prized mare was discovered dead in its stall, eyes wide with terror. Hoofprints in the dirt showed the animal had thrashed violently before collapsing. And who had been seen standing by the stables that night, silent, unmoving? Thomas, the youngest brother. When asked what he was doing there, Thomas only whispered, "She was afraid of me. They all are." The farmer spread the story to every neighbor, and by dawn, the town was in uproar. In a small Kansas town, fear spreads like wildfire. Soon, every misfortune, every broken limb, every ruined crop, every sickly cow was pinned on the Caldwell boys. A lantern dropped in a barn became Samuel's fault. A fever that took a child became Nathaniel's prophecy fulfilled. A woman's stillbirth was blamed on the sleepless eyes of Elias, watching from the road. Logic had no place here. Fear had taken the reins. On a July evening, a crowd gathered outside the Caldwell farmhouse. Men carried lanterns, pitchforks, and shotguns. Women clutched rosaries. Children clung to their mothers. The sheriff tried to calm them, insisting there was no evidence the boys had caused any harm. But the crowd was past reason. They demanded the brothers be driven out, or worse. Inside the farmhouse, the family barred the doors. Samuel stood at the window, his broad frame casting a shadow across the crowd. Elias, pale and sleepless, lingered behind him. Nathaniel calmly took notes in a small book, as though recording history itself.
And Thomas?
Thomas sat silently in the corner, eyes reflecting the lantern glow like a predator watching prey. Their father stepped onto the porch, his voice breaking as he pleaded with the mob. "They are only boys," he said.
Strange, yes, but not evil.
"God does not create evil," from the crowd a voice shouted back. "The devil does!" Others joined in, chanting, shouting, pushing forward. Some swore the air itself grew colder as the brothers stood in the windows watching. A few even claimed the lantern flames flickered, though no wind stirred. The mob teetered on the edge of violence. Some argued for exile to drive the brothers out and never let them return. Others demanded blood, claiming the town would never know peace until the curse was broken. But just as the shouting reached its peak, a storm rolled over the plains. Thunder cracked. Rain began to fall in sheets, scattering the crowd. To the fearful it was a sign. God himself perhaps had stayed their hands. The brothers were spared, for the moment. But the damage was done. From that night on, the Caldwell family was no longer part of the community. They were outcasts, prisoners in their own home, tolerated only because no one dared cross them directly. The first death had stained their name. The second tragedy had sealed it. Kansas had reached its breaking point. And now, the brothers' fate would no longer be decided by neighbors with pitchforks, but by men of science with sharper tools. After the breaking point in Kansas, local authorities realized the town could no longer contain the Caldwell brothers. Fear of mob violence, fear of scandal, fear of something worse, pushed the state to intervene. The brothers were taken from their farmhouse, not in chains, but under the watch of armed escorts. Their destination, an institute in Topeka, where men of science promised answers. But instead of answers, they found only more horror. The Caldwell boys were placed in separate rooms, though still within the same wing. Doctors believed separation might weaken whatever bond tied them together. But even apart, strange things happened. Samuel bent the iron frame of his bed as though it were kindling. Elias remained awake through every hour of the night, his eyes fixed on the door, as if waiting. Nathaniel demanded access to books from the medical library, and when denied, he began reciting passages from memory, word for word. And Thomas, though quiet, unnerved the nurses. They swore he whispered their names before they introduced themselves. Worse, he whispered things no one else knew. Secrets. One nurse resigned after Thomas muttered, "Your brother in St. Louis will not survive the winter." Weeks later, it proved true. Doctors, fascinated and horrified, subjected the brothers to countless tests. Samuel's strength was measured against grown men. He held his ground against 3 orderlies, forcing them back as though they were children. When weighed down with sandbags, he stood unshaken for hours, his heartbeat steady. Elias was tested for sleep. Days turned to weeks, yet no sign of fatigue appeared. His reflexes sharpened, his mind remained alert, and when placed in a dark chamber, he claimed he could hear the footsteps of others in dreams. Nathaniel's intellect baffled scholars. He solved puzzles, translated Latin texts, and drafted diagrams of machines years ahead of his time. His handwriting filled notebooks with symbols no one could decode. And Thomas resisted measurement. When doctors attempted hypnosis, the boy hypnotized the physician instead, murmuring in a voice that lulled the man into a trance. When questioned, Thomas only said, "You are asking the wrong questions. The Institute's reports, fragments of which survive. Today, Messina, filled with contradictions, described the brothers as human anomalies with heightened faculties. Others warned that they were something more or less.
Than human, doctors argued bitterly.
Were they miracles of evolution,
Aberrations.
or evidence of something supernatural? But one conclusion was universal. The Caldwell brothers defied every known category of science. As weeks passed, the Institute itself began to change. Nurses fell ill with fevers that spread to no one else. Lamps flickered in hallways without cause. Doors creaked open in the night, though locks remained fastened. Some staff whispered that the brothers were communicating silently, that their separation was meaningless. One orderly swore he heard Samuel's voice in his mind, commanding him to unlock the doors. Another dreamed of Elias standing at the foot of his bed, whispering through sleepless lips. The doctors dismissed it as hysteria, but hysteria spreads quickly in closed rooms. Rumors suggest there were other, darker experiments, trials never officially written down. It is said the brothers were exposed to extreme heat and cold. Samuel endured both without breaking. Elias walked barefoot across ice and left no mark. It is said poisons were administered in tiny doses, yet no sickness followed. And it is said that one night Thomas was asked to predict the outcome of a patient's illness in another ward. He gave a single word: death. The patient died before dawn. Coincidence or proof? The longer the Caldwell brothers remained at the Institute, the more the staff began to unravel. Doctors who had come with notebooks full of theories now left in silence, their eyes hollow. Nurses crossed themselves before entering the ward. One attendant fled in the night, refusing to return. The brothers, meanwhile, grew calmer, almost serene, as though the chaos around them only confirmed what they already knew: that the world was not ready to understand them, and perhaps never would be. The farmhouse had birthed a curse. The town had feared it. The Institute had tried to explain it, but science cannot cage what it does not understand. And soon the Caldwell brothers would prove that cages were never meant for them. The Caldwell brothers had been taken to the Institute so that science could explain them. But within months, it wasn't the brothers under study, it was the Institute itself unraveling. Because when you cage what defies nature, it isn't the subjects who break first. It's the walls around them. It started small. A lamp toppled in the corridor outside Samuel's room. Though no one touched it, a nurse slipped on dry stone floors, her ankle breaking cleanly. Elias, sitting silently in his chair, whispered to her as she was carried away, "You should not have been here today." Soon, equipment began failing. Locks rusted in days instead of years. Medical instruments vanished only to appear in strange places. One scalpel was found driven into the wooden ceiling above Nathaniel's cot, as if hurled by an unseen hand. Coincidence, the doctors said, but staff began refusing to work the night shift. Patients in other wards reported hearing footsteps at night. Some swore they heard Samuel's heavy breathing outside their doors, though he was locked in another wing. Others claimed Elias appeared in their dreams, whispering words they couldn't remember when they woke. And a few insisted Nathaniel left them notes, written in their own handwriting, but with knowledge they couldn't possibly have had. Thomas, the youngest, was the most feared. He rarely spoke, but when he did, misfortune followed. One orderly swore Thomas looked him in the eye and said, "The fall will break your neck." Days later, the man slipped while carrying supplies down the stairs. His neck snapped instantly. From then on, many refused to enter Thomas's room at all. Science prides itself on reason, but reason has limits. The physicians who had once filled their notebooks with theories now scribbled fewer notes each day. Some refused to examine the boys alone. Others abandoned the project entirely, leaving in silence, their faces pale. One doctor confessed in private correspondence, "I fear we are studying the wrong thing.
These boys are not the subject. We are.
They watch us with a patience that terrifies me." The Institute's director tried to maintain control. He ordered stricter protocols, harsher observation, even considered transferring the brothers to separate facilities. But by then, the staff was too afraid to touch them. The Caldwell brothers had become untouchable. Then came the night the Institute broke. It began with screaming in the women's ward. Lights flickered. Shadows stretched across the walls. Nurses swore they saw Elias standing in the hallway, though his door remained locked. Patients thrashed, shouting that Samuel was crushing them, though he was confined 2 floors away. By midnight, 2 fires had broken out. One in the kitchen, another in the records room. Both were extinguished quickly, but the damage was done. Half the staff fled before dawn. Those who remained whispered the truth no one wanted to say aloud. The Institute was cursed, and the curse had 4 faces, and through it all the brothers remained silent. Samuel sat in his cell, carving lines into the stone with his fingernails. Elias walked endless circles, never stopping, never blinking. Nathaniel filled page after page with diagrams and coded words no one could decipher, and Thomas lay on his cot, whispering to himself. When asked what he was saying, he replied only once, "We are waiting." No one dared ask what for. By the winter of 1882, the Institute had reached its breaking point. Too many staff gone, too many unexplained deaths, too much fear. The director ordered the brothers' transfer to another facility. But the paperwork never completed, the wagons never arrived, because one night, the Caldwell brothers were simply gone. The locks were unbroken, the windows still barred, the doors still closed, but their rooms stood empty, their beds unslept in, their writings left behind, and not a soul saw them leave. The Institute thought it could contain them. It thought science could measure them, pin them down, explain them. But the Caldwell brothers had never belonged to the world of reason, and when reason tried to hold them, it collapsed instead. When the Institute discovered the Caldwell brothers' rooms empty, panic rippled through its halls. The doors had not been forced. The windows were barred. The locks remained intact. It was as though the boys had simply dissolved into the night, and from that moment on, their story left the realm of science and slipped fully into legend. Authorities scrambled to craft an explanation. The official report claimed the brothers had died of illness, some vague, unnamed fever that took them all in a single week. Their bodies, it said, were disposed of quickly to prevent contagion, but locals noticed something odd. No funerals, no graves, no markers. The parents were never invited to mourn them. No minister claimed to have spoken last rites, and, in the absence of bodies, the whispers began. Farmers claimed they saw 4 shadows moving across the Kansas plains under the moonlight. Walking in perfect silence, a railway worker in Topeka swore he saw 4 boys boarding a train at midnight, their eyes catching the lantern light like animals. In Missouri, a widow claimed the brothers knocked on her door, asking for shelter. She let them in, only to find them gone by morning, leaving behind nothing but 4 muddy footprints on her wooden floorboards. The Institute denied every report, but the sightings spread, first across Kansas, then beyond. Over the next decade, stories surfaced in scattered places. In Colorado, 4 boys were seen standing at the edge of a collapsed mine, watching silently as rescuers pulled bodies from the rubble. None of the locals recognized them. In Illinois, a traveling circus reported losing its strongest man to a sudden, unexplained death. And that same night, 4 pale figures were spotted slipping away into the dark, and in New Orleans, a priest wrote in his diary of 4 children who never knelt, never blinked, and never left footprints in the dust of the cathedral. Were these mere tales, invented by frightened minds, or had the Caldwell brothers truly escaped?
Spreading their shadow across America?
As the rumors spread, something stranger began happening. The Institute's official files disappeared. Pages torn out, photographs burned, ledgers missing entire years. Even census records from the Caldwell family's town showed inconsistencies. 4 children in 1 year, none the next. It was as though someone, or something, wanted the brothers erased,
Not just from Kansas.
but from history itself. Yet fragments survived. A few diary entries, a half-burned letter, and above all, the eyewitness accounts of those who swore they had seen the brothers long after their supposed deaths. In Kansas, parents warned children not to wander at night, lest they meet the four brothers who walked without sound. Farmers swore their cattle grew restless when four shadows crossed the fields. The legend became a tool, a way to scare the disobedient, to explain misfortune, to give shape to the fears of the prairie. But behind the folklore, there was always that lingering unease. What if it wasn't just a story? What if the Caldwell brothers were still out there, watching, waiting, moving silently from place to place? The Institute said they died. The records say they vanished. The people say they walked on, four brothers who defied science, four brothers who haunted medicine, and if the stories are true, they may still walk beneath the same moon that watches you tonight. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Caldwell brothers had passed fully into the shadows of folklore. Some believed they had died in that Kansas institute, their bodies hidden by fearful doctors. Others swore they had escaped, roaming America like restless spirits in human skin. But whether they died, vanished, or endured, one truth remained. They had defied both faith and science, and their legacy still lingers like a whisper in the prairie wind. In Kansas, the farmhouse that once held the family was abandoned, left to rot. Locals avoided it, swearing the soil itself was cursed. In time, the structure collapsed, the wood sinking into the earth. Nothing remains today but weeds and silence. Records of the brothers dwindled. School rosters where their names once appeared were torn out. Census documents miscounted the family. Church ledgers skipped over baptisms. It was as though four children had been erased, not just from life, but from memory, and yet fragments remained. A diary from a farm girl who wrote of seeing Aaliyah staring at her window in the moonlight.
A physician's notebook describing Nathaniel's unnatural intelligence.
A nurse's letter whispering that Thomas predicted her death. These scraps are all that survive. But sometimes, scraps are enough to build legends. Doctors who had studied the brothers never agreed on what they were. Some argued they represented evolution, the next step of mankind. Others believed they were aberrations, destined to vanish as quickly as they appeared. And a few, whispering in private, insisted they were not human at all. That they had walked into Kansas from somewhere else. Not from heaven, not from hell, but from an unknown place our world was never meant to see. The Caldwell brothers forced an entire generation to ask questions it was not ready to answer. What is human?
What is natural? And most terrifying of all,
What comes after us? Even today, the legend persists. Travelers through Leavenworth County claim to feel watched when the moonlight hits the fields. Farmers swear their animals grow restless on nights when four shadows seem to move against the grass. A handful of modern researchers have attempted to trace the brothers through census data, property records, death certificates. Every trail ends in contradiction, as though the paper itself refuses to carry their names. And so, their legacy is not written in ink or stone, but in whispers, sightings, and the uneasy feeling that somewhere, the brothers are still out there,
still watching.
still waiting. Perhaps the most chilling thought is not whether the Caldwell brothers survived. It is whether they were unique at all. What if they were not the only ones? What if other families in other towns gave birth to children who defied explanation? What if the brothers were not a curse or a miracle, but simply the beginning? And if that is true, then the question is not what happened to them. The question is, how many more are walking among us now? So I leave it with you, the listener, the witness to this tale. Were the Caldwell brothers cursed, chosen, evolved, or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments what you believe. And if this story has unsettled you, if it has reminded you that history hides secrets stranger than fiction, then subscribe to Cold Mysteries, because every week we step into another shadow the world tried to bury. But remember this, some shadows follow you home.
And tonight,
You may not be alone.